Hello aspirants and welcome again to Legacy IAS Academy. Here we continue with our detailed analysis of the economic survey, and now let's continue with the second chapter of the economic survey. So in this lecture of the economic survey, we will cover two broad things. One is the concept of important terms and definitions that the economic survey has mentioned in this chapter. Now see, we will be taking up terms and definitions, but these are those terms and definitions which are not that prevalently used, but economic survey has mentioned it, or at times in one of the chapter we will also see the economic survey has come up with new concept as well. So all these things will be covered in each and every chapter moving forward. So that is one thing. Second is, of course, the chapter itself, that is fiscal developments, anchoring stability through credible consolidation. We will look at it in detail with respect to UPSC civil services examination. So let's get started with the second chapter. So as far as the economic terms and important terms and definitions are concerned, there are two main things which economic survey mentions in this chapter. One is the just in time fund release concept, and the other is the effective capital deficit. Now this, why have I included this? Because in your standard books the word effective capital expenditure as such is not present, right? In one of the places it is having a sort of a small reference to it, but not in great detail. So let us understand first what is the effective capital expenditure. Now, there are two types of expenditure. One is the revenue expenditure and the other is the capital expenditure. Now, whenever you hear the word revenue, whether it's revenue receipt or revenue expenditure, it is going to be that revenue receipt or revenue expenditure which does not impact the asset and liability situation. Hence, a revenue expenditure is an expenditure which does not increase your asset nor lowers your liability. So when you do a revenue expenditure, your asset will not increase. It is not going to lead to a formation of any asset, and the liability will also not decrease. So neither the asset increases nor liability decreases. That is revenue expenditure. But on the other hand, when you do a capital expenditure, it will either increase your asset or lower your liability. So it will either increase the asset or lower the liability. Now, because of this, the kind of examples here will be what? Let us say you are paying off the loan. So that is a capital expenditure. The principal part of the loan you are paying, that's a capital expenditure. Why? It lowers your liability. But here, if you look at the example of revenue expenditure, if let's say you are paying the salaries, so that is a revenue expenditure because it's neither generating an asset nor lowering your liability, right? So this is the concept of revenue and capital expenditure. Now we are interested in the capital expenditure. So as I mentioned, capital expenditure is that expenditure which either increases your asset or lowers your liability. But then what is the effective capital expenditure or the effective capex, effective capital expenditure? See, what happens is the central government does the capital expenditure. So you have the capital expenditure of the central government. That means the expenditure done by the central government which either increases its assets or reduces its liability. That is your capital expenditure. But the central government also gives grants for the states or to the states for what? For capital formation, for capital asset creation, right? So some of the money is given by the central to the state government for asset creation. And when you include that grant also, which is given by the center to the state for capital asset creation, and you club these two, that gives you the effective capital expenditure. That means what? That means the effective capital expenditure will be greater than the capital expenditure. Is this clear? Right? There is only one case wherein it will not be greater, when the grants for capital asset creation to the state, if this becomes zero, then your effective capital expenditure will be equal to the capital expenditure. Correct? So that is the concept of effective capital expenditure. Remember its formula: effective capital expenditure is equal to the capital expenditure of the central government plus the grants for capital asset creation given by the central government to the state government. That is why you can see it in this graph also, which we'll see later on as well, that this is the capital expenditure. So this is basically the capital expenditure which you can see is increasing. This is the grant in aid for capital asset creation to the state, this particular portion, right? So that is why the effective capital expenditure is going to be more over here, right? Now next concept is the just in time fund release. Just in time fund release. Now what is this concept? See, previously the government used to transfer the funds in bulk to the ministry for the schemes, etc. That means, let's say for example, for Manrega scheme, if 36,000 crore was allocated for Manrega scheme, this is just an example. Let's take an example that 36,000 crore rupees is allocated for Manrega scheme for one financial year. So the government is going to transfer in bulk. Bulk in the sense that not necessarily completely 36,000 crore, but let's say 18,000 crore rupees or 9,000 crore rupees or 20,000 crore, some bulk amount, right? And then the next time the remaining amount. So that is the bulk fund transfer. But that does not help. Why does it not help? See, for example, if you take a loan, right, loan for constructing a house. So if you're taking a loan of 50 lakh to construct a house, you don't get the entire money in all together, right? And you get money when you get the money, you show some work, you get more money, you show some more work, you get more money. So the idea is to give money in compartments. That is one thing, not as bulk. Why not? Because if the money is kept with you for a longer period of time, you don't even need it right now. So same is the case when the funds are allocated. If you are given funds in bulk, you would be paying up the Manrega workers to for other things, other requirement over a period of a year, over a period of 6 months. That means you don't need the entire money right now. For the next 1 week, you need only 1,000 crore rupees, then maybe 200 crore rupees more. So at different points of time, you need different amount of money. So if you have too much of money right now with you, that money is going to lose its value. Inflation is going to erode its value. Plus, you don't even need it right now, right? That money could have been invested elsewhere. That money could have generated some value. That money could have been used somewhere else wherein urgent requirement might have been there. Whereas for you as such, there is no urgency with respect to such a huge amount. So the government has moved on to just-in-time fund release. That means the moment you need it, it is only then the fund will be given to you, and beforehand additional money will not be transferred to you. So what are the benefits of it? It of course improves the cash management. It reduces the idle balances lying aside. It enhances the transparency, because every time you need, you know exactly for what it is being used, or else you might take it in bulk and spend on XYZ thing, and there is no accountability as well. It will strengthen the expenditure efficiency also. So by bringing this, the government has replaced the credit push model of bulk fund release. Credit push, pushing the credit, giving the credit in bulk in order to completely give the amount, not completely but in bulk. Now this has been replaced by the debit pull model. Whenever you need, you debit it from the government. That is the whole idea. So that's the concept of just in time, right? Now this just in time fund release is implemented through two different models or two different schemes. That name you should remember. UPSC can directly ask you questions on that. This is mentioned in your economic survey. We are not going beyond it. Any concept within it is what we are discussing. So one is SMA Sparsh, which is single nodal account, Samyochit Pranali Ekikrit Shigra Hastantran for centrally sponsored scheme. Now, what are centrally sponsored schemes? See, you have two types of central government schemes. One is the central sector scheme, the other is a centrally sponsored scheme. Central sector scheme means the entire fund is allocated by the government of India, whereas centrally sponsored scheme means that the central government plus the state government both are involved over here. So this is single nodal account, Samyochit Pranali Ekikrit Shigra Hastantran. Shigra means immediate. Shigra means immediate. Hastantran means disbursal, to give it to someone. Okay. Sorry. Samyochit means appropriate, the amount that would be needed. Appropriate. Pranali means a system, a channel, a system. Ekatrit means total. So an appropriate system for total immediate transfer of funds for the centrally sponsored scheme. That is one thing. Second is the treasury single account and the TSA hybrid model for the central sector scheme. So in both the centrally sponsored scheme as well as the central sector scheme, they have included this particular concept of just in time. Very important. Now, Shali, let's move ahead and now let's delve deep into chapter number 2. Right? So let's get started with this. So here you have the trends in deficit indicators of the center. So these are deficit indicators. Now throughout the economic survey, you will see a comparison with respect to pre-COVID period, then what happened in COVID, and then post-COVID period. And throughout economic survey, it is trying to tell us that we have reached the pre-COVID period or not, and are we doing better than the pre-COVID period or not. So here also you see, this is the COVID year, basically the impact, and this is slightly before COVID. In some of the graphs you will have 4 years, 5 years before COVID data also available. Now, as we all know that during COVID, the deficit of the government had increased, which is clear over here. This is the fiscal deficit. It shot up to 9.2%. There was a sharp decline then, and now we are trying to control it, and it is budgeted estimate is of 4.4%, and this year's budget also estimates that in fiscal year 26-27 it will be 4.3%. So these are important numbers. This number you can remember, and this number also you should remember. Then next is your revenue deficit. Revenue deficit, all the deficits you can see follow the same pattern. It also increased, then declined, and is now at 1.5%. Then you have the primary deficit. Again, it increased, declined, and now we are trying to control it at 0.8%. Now the question is, what are these deficits? Fiscal, revenue, and primary. So let us understand the deficits over here, right? So first, let me give you a brief of all the deficits that are there, including these three. So first, we have budget deficit equals to total expenditure minus total receipt. A very straightforward deficit this is, right? Now, in total expenditure, you have basically the revenue expenditure as well as the capital expenditure, and in total receipt, you have the revenue receipt as well as the capital receipt. Now, next is your revenue deficit, which we have seen over here. This is your revenue deficit. Now, what is revenue deficit? In revenue deficit, you will only take the revenue expenditure. So this becomes your revenue expenditure minus this is going to be your revenue receipt. So this is your revenue deficit. Now, one thing they have not mentioned in this particular graph is the effective revenue deficit, which is very, very important. Remember that, effective revenue deficit. Now, why it is important? See, there is an act known as the FRBM Act, that is Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which came in 2003, which gives basically the limitations or the upper limit as to how much should be the fiscal deficit and the revenue deficit. But later on it got amended, and instead of targeting revenue deficit, it now targets the effective revenue deficit. So what is this effective revenue deficit? See, in your revenue deficit, there is a component known as revenue expenditure, correct? Now, in this revenue expenditure, that money that is given to the state for capital asset creation, remember in effective capital expenditure we discussed that. So that money which is given to the states for capital asset creation is also included in revenue expenditure. But should that be included? Absolutely not, because using that money, the asset is being created. So we need to remove that part from revenue deficit. When you remove that part from revenue deficit, you basically get the effective revenue deficit. So what will be your effective revenue deficit? It will be revenue deficit minus grants to state for capital asset creation. For capital asset creation, this is your effective revenue deficit. Then you have the concept of fiscal deficit. Now, why do we need the fiscal deficit? It is because in your budget deficit, which is total expenditure minus total receipt, see, your total receipt here also includes the loans that you are taking, and that exactly is the problem. Think by yourself that let's say you have a household budget and you say that my total expenditure is 1 lakh rupees and my total receipt is also 1 lakh rupees. So my budget deficit is equals to 0, and you think everything is good. But is it good? No, not necessarily. Why? Because there is a possibility that this 1 lakh rupees of receipt that you have, a part of it, let us say around 25,000 out of it is nothing but your loan that you are taking. So if 25,000 is the loan, that means you are not doing as well as this budget deficit presents. Why? Because this 25,000 is a loan which you have to return back, correct? As a result of which, to ensure or to know the real situation, we come up with a fiscal deficit which in the receipt section does not include the loans that you are taking, does not include the debt creating capital receipt. So we will have fiscal deficit equals total expenditure minus, here it was total receipt. Now total receipt includes what? Revenue receipt plus capital receipt. So revenue receipt will be as it is, but capital receipt includes what? The debt creating capital receipts, which is loans, and the non-debt creating capital receipts, which is the money that you get when you disinvest in the PSUs. So you will avoid the debt creating capital receipts and you will take only the non-debt creating capital receipts, and this will give you the fiscal deficit. Now what happens is, since this 25,000 is your loan, that is the debt creating capital receipt which you will not take into account. So what happens? 1 lakh is your total expenditure and only 75,000 is your total revenue, right? Total receipt, as a result of which there is a deficit of 25,000, and this 25,000 of deficit is nothing but your fiscal deficit. I hope that's clear. Now there is another concept of primary deficit which is mentioned here. Now what is that? See, even when your total expenditure is over here, we have not touched the total expenditure so far, but now we will. So the total expenditure that you have, a part of that expenditure, in fact a very good part of that expenditure also goes to the interest payments. Now these interest payments are for the loans, not just the year, not just the previous year, but the previous years and years that would have been there, which creates a huge burden on the government of India. So you would not understand what is the present situation, because the previous burden is also included in that. So to understand the exact present situation, you minus the interest payment in order to get the primary deficit. So therefore, your primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus the interest payment. And interest payment is a huge amount. In fact, 20% of the government's budget amount is going to the interest payment, right? So here what happens is, from fiscal deficit, when you remove the interest payment, you get the primary deficit. And revenue deficit is simply the revenue expenditure minus the revenue receipt. I hope all these concepts are here clear. Now next is the decomposition of the fiscal deficit of the center. As I said that in fiscal deficit, what are the components? Total expenditure minus revenue receipt plus non-debt creating capital receipt. We have not included the debt creating capital receipt over here. So let us see what all things are included in this. You have the revenue deficit, which has gone down, which is a good thing. Capital expenditure, if you look at, the capital expenditure has increased. Non-debt capital receipts, if also look at, so non-debt capital receipts are also seen, they are small in number, but there is basically the negative, which was negative 7.3, has at least lowered to negative 4.8. So the performance as such with respect to capital expenditure etc. is quite good. Now the concept of the effective capital expenditure that we understood, there is this graph of that which we have seen, that the capital expenditure has increased, the grants in aid for capital formation has increased, and as a result the effective capital expenditure also has increased as such. Now here it's the capital expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure. So capital expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure has also seen a continual increase. There is a slight dip, but overall it has increased. Effective capital expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure has also continually increased over here. Now is it a good thing or a bad thing? It is a good thing. To have an increasing percentage of capital expenditure is a good thing. Why? Because capital expenditure is either going to increase your asset or lower your liability. Both the things are good. Whereas revenue expenditure will neither increase your asset nor lower the liability. So it is not that good. That does not mean that you should have zero revenue expenditure. That is not even possible, right? Because you have to give the salaries, you have to spend for welfare schemes, so on and so forth. But the increasing percentage of capital expenditure and the effective capital expenditure is a good sign for the economy. Next is the deficit indicator, which reflects prudent fiscal management. So what are these deficit indicators? So the important number over here would be the yellow one. So what are they trying to showcase? So what are they trying to showcase? Basically, this is your revenue deficit for 2020. This is your revenue deficit for 2024. Green color symbolizes 24, blue is 25, yellow is 26. Now what is this number 68.2? Basically, the idea is how much percentage of the deficit has been consumed. That means if I am saying that my overall deficit in a year is going to be 100, so how much have I used till the month of November? That is what this number signifies. So if you talk about the revenue deficit, 68.2% has been consumed, fiscal deficit 62.3, and primary deficit 78.9. That means in the coming months only 31.8% needs to be consumed. That is the only space that I have left. Here I have 37.7% of capacity left, and here I have 21.1% of capacity left. That is what it is signifying, and that's a very prudent situation to be, is what it is saying with respect to the amount of borrowing and all which is going to happen. It is going to ensure that we remain within the limit that has been set. Okay, let's move ahead. Now this is your, again, deficit indicator of the states. So how are states doing? Let us have a look. So first you have revenue deficit in brown. So if you look at the revenue deficit, again due to the COVID period it increased, but then it has fallen, but in financial year 25 it is again high. But you can see that we are trying to reduce it after subsequent to the COVID period in which it had increased. If you look at the capital outlay, now the capital outlay has been increasing consistently, which is again a good thing. If you look at the loans and advances, so loans and advances part, which was again quite high over here, had gone down over here, again increased, but then again lower, and to an extent that is lower. So it is quite resilient and robust. There is not a continuous increase of the loans as such. Then you have the non-debt creating capital receipts. So the non-debt creating capital receipts, as you can see, it is in the green, it is mentioned. So again it has sort of lowered. Then you have the fiscal deficit. Now this is probably the most important parameter which is shown in this graph. So fiscal deficit, if you look at for the states, now remember that the state's fiscal deficit is less than the central government's fiscal deficit. Question on this fact can be asked. But here also during COVID it had gone up, but then it went down, but it has still kept on increasing consistently, and it is at 3.2%, which is of course less than that of the central government. Right now, fiscal deficit excluding SASCI. Now, what is this SASCI that is there? Basically, this is the amount the government is transferring to the state government if they are using it for the capital formation. So, if you exclude that, then the fiscal deficit goes down further. That means, but that's not a problem, because if you are using that, your capital expenditure is going to be high. So, that is also a good sign only. That because if the fiscal deficit is 3.2, but if you exclude SASCI, the fiscal deficit is 2.8. So deficit is less, that is good. But the thing is that money which is being provided here is used for capital expenditure, which is a good expenditure that is being done. Next, you have the capital outlay sourced from the state's own resources. So the total capital outlay, and this is the capital outlay excluding SASCI. This is basically the scheme for asset formation, the money given to the state for asset formation. So if the money given to the state for asset formation is excluded, then the total capital outlay, you can see, is going to be way low than what it is now. That means the central government SASCI scheme is actually helping here. I hope that's clear. Now let's move ahead to the next. This is the center's debt trajectory. Now this probably is one of the most important graph over here. I'll tell you the reason why. See, we have seen the concept of fiscal deficit, right? And as I mentioned, there is an FRBM Act which tries to limit this particular deficit. FRBM Act says that we should limit it to less than equal to 3%. But as we have seen, it is at 4.4%, and next year it will be at 4.3%. Right? So it is higher. However, the government is of course trying to control it, but in this year's economic survey and even in subsequent budget, the government has said that it will sort of move away from managing the fiscal deficit number and rather focus on the concept known as debt to GDP ratio. So the government wants to focus on debt to GDP ratio, which presently is 55.7, right? And it is basically the revised estimate that is there. Now the target that the government has set is that by 2030 this debt to GDP ratio, the government wants to have it brought down to 50%, and targeting an exact number is quite difficult. So the government is targeting a range. The range that is targeted is 49% to 51%. This is what it targets. The main target is 50%, but we will be maintaining it between 49 to 51%. What we will be maintaining? Debt to GDP ratio. So if India's GDP is $4.18 trillion, that means India's debt will be presently 55.7% of that GDP. That means slightly over $2.2 trillion. Now this looks like a huge number. It is big, and that is why we are trying to bring it down as well. But if you sort of compare it with the Western world, it is quite less. You have Italy with debt to GDP ratio 127%. There are countries with beyond 100%, some countries beyond 200% as well. So this is what we are going to focus as, and this chart exactly tells us the debt to GDP trajectory over here. So that trajectory, as you can see, outstanding liabilities of the center percent of GDP as compared to the percentage of GDP. So in financial year 19, it was within 50%. Then it increased during the COVID period. It went beyond 62%. Then we brought it down. Now we are bringing it down. It is at this, and by 2030, we want it to be at 50%. Now the question is, why the government wants to target the debt to GDP ratio? Because this debt to GDP ratio is more flexible, and the government can create more space for themselves by increasing their GDP. It is more flexible in nature, gives more flexibility to the government as such. So these are the important terms, definitions, deficits, and concepts mentioned in your chapter 2. So stay tuned, subscribe to Legacy IAS Academy so that you get the notification of all the upcoming chapters of economic survey as well. Thank you.